At 11:45 on a cool June morning in 1942, a man walked unshackled through the gates of the most feared building in occupied Prague, a place where men entered in chains and were never seen again. And yet this man's footsteps echoed in a way that would rewrite the fate of an entire resistance movement. His name was Carl Chura, a $50 smile on his lips and the weight of a continent's terror in his racing heart. But what made him cross that threshold was not courage or conviction, it was fear. And love, and an unbearable longing to save the ones he cherished most, even if doing so meant damning everyone else. From the moment he leapt into the night 3 months earlier, strapped in a British bomber destined for the forests of Czechoslovakia, Carl's story was supposed to be one of heroism, a tale of a volunteer who chose to fight behind enemy lines against the Nazis with nothing but grit and a whisper of hope. The training had been grueling in Scotland, a remote place where the wind howled like the ghosts of 1,000 lost soldiers, and every dawn broke with the chill reminder that the world was at war, that heroes were forged in fire or shattered like glass. Alongside Lieutenant Adolf Opala and Ivan Kalashik, Carl had been schooled in the arts of sabotage, in the silent death of whispered plans and midnight rendezvous, in the sacred bond of men who had accepted that returning home was never guaranteed. But the night they dropped was wrong from the very start. They missed their target zone by miles, landing in hostile ground where every rustle of leaves could be the approach of a killer in a Gestapo uniform. Kalashik was discovered almost immediately, and faced with the choice between torture and death, he chose to take his own life, a clean exit from a dirty war that would haunt the others forever. Opala was wounded, his breath shallow, the taste of blood in his mouth when Carl left him to scramble alone through fields and forests, clutching hope as tightly as he clutched his pack. Days turned into weeks, and Carl drifted, a ghost among safe houses, shuffling from attic to cellar with no one to share the burden, no comrades to shoulder the fear that mounted with each passing sunrise. Meanwhile, 2 other paratroopers, Joseph Gabčík and Jan Kubis, were preparing something audacious that the world would later remember as the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, the Reichsprotector of Bohemia and Moravia, the man Hitler called the man with the iron heart. Their attack on May 27, 1942, was brutal and precise. Gabčík's gun jammed at the wrong moment, and Kubis hurled a modified anti-tank grenade that tore through the open Mercedes, wounding Heydrich grievously. He did not die immediately. The infection set in, the sepsis spread, and 8 days later, on June 4th, the Iron Heart finally stopped. The Nazi response was instant and merciless, a storm of terror that swallowed villages whole, that turned streets into rivers of blood, that razed homes and shot farmers and burned children alive in gas chambers without even the pretense of trial. In Lidice, the men were executed, the women shipped to Ravensbrück, the children gassed in Chelno, the village erased from maps as if it had never existed. In Lizaki, the exact same horror unfolded, and the message could not have been clearer. Until the assassins were found, until the killers of Heydrich were caught, this land would know no mercy. For 3 weeks the Gestapo's net closed tighter and tighter, thousands arrested, tortured, executed, and still no answers, still no break in the silence of the underground. Then came the promise of amnesty, a lie coated in gold. Anyone who came forward with information leading to the assassins would be spared and rewarded with 5 million protectorate crowns, a fortune that could buy freedom and more. In a village called Nova Hurka, Carl Chura read the lists of the executed, saw the names of fathers and brothers and neighbors, felt their ghosts whisper his name in the attic where he hid under a thin quilt of fear and remorse, knowing that if he were discovered the Nazis would kill his family in retribution. The pressure was a vice around his heart, squeezing tighter with every knock on a door, every whispered rumor of a raid, and Carl cracked. On June 13 he wrote an anonymous letter to the Zizkov station in Benisov, naming Gabčík and Kubis as the assassins of Heydrich, but the Gestapo ignored it, drowned as they were in a flood of claims and lies. 3 days later he took a train to Prague, pacing back and forth in a cloud of cigarette smoke, his hands shaking so badly that the Svab family who harbored him begged him to stop, to cease drawing attention, but Carl could not stop, not when the weight of his terror pressed against his skull like a fist. He went to the apartment of Joseph and Marie Svetova, desperate for word of Gabčík and Kubis. But they knew nothing, or pretended not to, sensing that something was wrong with the man who had once trained alongside them. Then Carl walked into the Gestapo headquarters at Pekarska Palace and gave them everything he knew, not just the identities of the assassins, but the names and addresses of dozens who had helped them, safe houses in Prague and Pardubice and Pelhřimov, networks of resistance that had taken years to build now laid bare in an instant. What Carl did not know was where the paratroopers were hiding, the crypt beneath the church of Saints Cyril and Methodius on Roslova Street, a sanctuary blessed by Father Vladimir Petrek and Bishop Goras, where 7 men, including Gabčík, Kubis, Opala, and others, had taken shelter in the shadow of sacred stone. As Chura spoke to his captors in that cold office, outside unseen by him, the Gestapo's net was tightening around the city, and within hours a raid would begin that would echo through history. At 4 in the morning of June 18, 1942, approximately 750 SS and Gestapo agents surrounded the church, their boots thundering on cobblestone as they closed in on the crypt where devotion met desperation. Inside, the paratroopers heard the roar, the shouts, and knew that their last stand had come. Above in the prayer loft, Opala, Kubis, and Bublik fought fiercely, their bullets answering the assault as grenades exploded like thunder in the narrow stone corridors. Opala was hit in the chest, his breath a shallow whisper in the cold air, while Kubis staggered, bleeding, and Bublik fell beside them, the echo of his fall a lament in the gloom. Below, Gabčík, Valčík, Ruzicka, and Svark were trapped, their minds a storm of prayer and panic, knowing surrender was a fate worse than death. 4 hours the SS tried every method, flooding the crypt with water from fire hoses, battering the ancient walls, drilling for entry. But the resistance stood, and when final silence fell after nearly 7 hours, the bodies were found, lifeless, but unbowed, killed not by enemy bullets but by their own hands to deny their captors the victory of life. Carl Chura was brought to identify them, his face reflected in puddles of blood and dust, pointing to men he had trained with, broken by the terrible choices that war exacts upon the souls of those who survive, and as he spoke their names a chill ran through the street like an omen of ruin, for those 7 lives were symbols of sacrifice, of defiance, and now they were gone. Their deaths a testament to both courage and the horrifying cost of betrayal. News of the fall of the crypt spread through the protectorate like a plague. The Gestapo, armed with the names Carl Chura had betrayed, launched a campaign of arrest and execution that swept through cities, villages, and farms, dragging men and women from their beds at dawn, slitting throats without trial, shooting families in courtyards, and deporting hundreds to concentration camps where the air itself seemed to burn with despair. On October 24, 1942, a transport of 262 prisoners arrived at Mauthausen, among them Alois Moravec and his son Otakar, who were shot at 2-minute intervals in the camp's execution yard, their deaths a cold punctuation in a ledger of cruelty, and the image of Otakar, just 21, his life snuffed out before even he understood what it had meant to be young in a world torn by hatred, became one of the darkest symbols of the price paid by ordinary people for daring to resist. Carl Chura, meanwhile, received the golden reward he had been promised, 5 million protectorate crowns, a new identity as Karl Gerhardt, and German citizenship. But the victory was a hollow one, for money could not buy back the faces of the dead that haunted his dreams, nor could it silence the cries of mothers whose sons would never return. He married a German woman named Antonia, and they had a son, yet even within the walls of his home, the ghost pursued him, whispering in the night, pressing against his ribs with the weight of every life he had broken, until he drank to forget, and forgot to drink, sinking deeper into an abyss where memory and guilt were indistinguishable. The Gestapo kept him close, for now he was their tool, a weapon turned inward, deployed to root out other paratroopers dropped in later waves, just as a blacksmith uses the broken blade of a friend to forge instruments of war. And Carl became exactly what the psychologists would say he was, a man who had identified with his aggressors, whose betrayal had reshaped him into something unrecognizable, someone who could never again find peace. Yet peace was a stranger to Czechoslovakia in those days. The war still raged, and as 1945 dawned the Third Reich's power began to crumble, its foundations cracking under the weight of advancing armies and the collapse of the very ideologies that had once promised glory and instead delivered slaughter. In May of that year, the Prague uprising erupted, citizens rising with whatever weapons they could carry, knives, rifles, sheer defiance, fighting for liberation in a city that had known only occupation and terror for so long. Carl Chura, sensing the end was near, fled west with his wife and child, toward the promise of American lines, but the past clung to him like a shadow, and on May 15th he walked into a police station in Maintin and surrendered, claiming to be a Czechoslovak paratrooper, technically true but fatally incomplete. For a few days his claim went unchallenged, and he was even issued a certificate confirming his service with the resistance, a bitter irony that must have tasted of ashes on his tongue, until the truth emerged in witness after witness who came forward to tell the full story of the betrayals, the deaths, the names he had handed over as if they were nothing more than chess pieces in a game he no longer understood. Arrested and held for trial, Carl watched as his life was stripped bare in a Prague courtroom. The evidence lay before him like a tombstone engraving, clear and undeniable, and when the prosecutor asked how he could betray men who would have died for him, Carl offered a response that would echo through Czech history. "I think you would have done the same for 1,000,000 marks." Those words, hollow and haunting, captured something terrible about human nature, not ideology or conviction, but the cold calculus of fear and survival, and they would be remembered long after his body was nothing but dust. On April 28, 1947, the trial of Carl Chura and another collaborator, William Garrick, began, and in less than a day the verdict was certain. When asked if he wished to request clemency from President Edvard Beneš, Carl declined, a strange relief washing over him as if the gallows were a release from the torment that had pursued him like a hound through every waking moment since that first step into Gestapo headquarters. On April 29, at 11:45 a.m., William Garrick was led to the gallows in the courtyard of Pankrak prison, his last words a strange, almost absurd joke. "Do you want me to say hello to anyone in heaven?" And 12 minutes later, at 11:57 a.m., Carl Chura followed him into the void, asking for a final cigarette even as the trapdoor opened beneath his feet and the rope claimed his life, ending at age 35 a story that had begun with hope and ended in ruin. History remembers Carl Chura as a traitor, and rightly so. His information led directly to the deaths of hundreds of Czech patriots and the destruction of a vast resistance network that had dared to stand against tyranny. Yet he had also been a volunteer who risked his life to fight the Nazis, a man whose courage was real but whose will broke under pressure no bullets could have cracked. The Church of Saints Cyril and Methodius in Prague still stands, and visitors can descend into the crypt where 7 paratroopers made their last stand, where bullet holes scarred the walls and the ventilation shaft they fired through remains as a testament to their courage, a silent reminder that in the crucible of war some men find their price and others discover they have none. And in that revelation lies a truth as painful as the memory of Carl Chura's final breath: courage and betrayal walk a fine line under fire, and the cost of war is never measured simply in victories but in the breaking of human souls.